One of the most common struggles of societies emerging from a violent conflict is the struggle to reinvent or reimagine the nation. It's said in the process, the critical question becomes what to do with the traumatic knowledge of the past. Education, some have said, is crucial for asserting political visions for a new society and for signaling a clear break with the past. Monuments have been inscribed with new meanings, and acquisition and collecting policies have changed at existing museums to embrace a wider definition of culture. So museums form part of the education of our history, but criticism of it are that limited knowledge sources affect their efficacy. Other social projects like skills transfer have served to pass on knowledge systems, but have we memorialized our country's history accurately enough to engender reconciliation? Let's find out. We're joined this evening by Freedom Park CEO Johann Mufamadi, farmer and entrepreneur Johann Liebenberg, and Professor Noor Nieftagodien is from Wits history workshop. He'll tell us a little bit more about that. In fact, let's start with you, Professor. I mean, if we're saying we are trying to create a new cultural capital that will help us achieve reconciliation, have we done enough in terms of adequate or good job in memorializing our history, in helping us reconcile? And what is the role of history in doing all of this?
Well, Sapiso, that's a complex question that has different parts to it. I suspect the place to start is to acknowledge that, notwithstanding many efforts over the last 26 years to achieve and potentially define reconciliation, that we have fallen short. I believe that any conversation about this must acknowledge that. Otherwise, we are, as the President said, we're living in a dream. Reconciliation was, of course, aimed at achieving some kind of nationhood, acknowledging various forms of diversity, difference, and so on, and to forge out of not only differences, but a contentious past, a very bloody past, defined by dispossession, exploitation, etc. And I think that we could say that in 2020 we're very far off from the ideals that were articulated in the mid-1990s. Now, there are many parts to it. You're asking, have we done enough to uncover the various aspects of our history that could contribute to, I would say, not in an artificial way, forging a new nation, but making people aware of the different elements of our history, the political aspects, the contentious political aspects. So you can take colonialism, segregation, apartheid, those who impose the oppressive systems on the majority, and the fight back, the struggle for liberation. We have done some work in relation to that. And so while I'm saying on the one hand that we have fallen short, we also have to acknowledge that we have done some things. But I think all of these things have been done inadequately. So where I stand from cities, I would say that we've done some work around history. We have done some work around changing the heritage landscape. But these are very contentious spaces, and a lot more needs to be done.
So we'll talk about why they're contentious and what needs to be done. Ms. Mufamadi, as Professor there says, we've done some of the work. Some of the work has been done by you as Freedom Park. You're part of the transformative agenda. You had an ambition at inception of correcting the skewed historical accounts and ensuring that our history reflects all who are part of South Africa. Have we reaped the benefits of it? Are the fruits bearing, is your labor bearing fruit? Is there evidence of that?
Yes, I will say definitely yes, we have made some progress and we have achieved a lot. And I do agree with the professor that a lot more still needs to be done. But if we look at Freedom Park, and particularly if we look at its mandate and in the context of reconciliation, Freedom Park was conceptualized to honor those who died for freedom and humanity and to contribute through its programs to social cohesion and nation building. And in conceptualizing Freedom Park, we had to ask ourselves a lot of questions to say, what is it that we are constructing, for who, and what purpose will it serve? Because we also know, particularly in South Africa, the majority of South Africans don't even visit these heritage sites because previously what was represented there did not reflect who they are. So Freedom Park in its conceptualization was a celebration of the attainment of our freedom in honoring those who sacrificed for it. And to do that, we had to emancipate the African voice in its diversity, to celebrate unity in diversity, so that when all South Africans and even the international communities visit Freedom Park, they can see themselves reflected one way or the other. And it was not just about belaboring the past and or preserving the past, but it's also preserving the past so that we draw lessons from them to address the current challenges that we're facing as a country, but also to chart a way for the future. So irrespective of who you are, in terms of your belief systems and in terms of your cultural background, if you come to a place like Freedom Park as a transformed heritage landscape, you see yourself reflected one way.
May I ask this question, Ms. Mufamadi? In regards to the commemorative markers, was it difficult ensuring that Freedom Park carries that? Because I mentioned before that knowledge sources has always been a problem in reflecting our history here, because the works of African intellectuals haven't been celebrated. So when you're looking for artifacts, obviously we weren't part of the mainstream celebrated artistic industry. Was it difficult to find those things?
It was challenging, but luckily South Africans and also the international communities who have artifacts that reflects who we are as Africans and as South Africans were willing to contribute. And the interesting aspect is that Freedom Park did not want to duplicate what has already been done. So we focused on making and creating maximum coherence. So a lot of our artifacts that reflects who we are as South Africans are actually artifacts from other entities, but also contributions in particular by the veterans of the liberation struggle. So some have given us their liberation movements artifacts, some have given us personal artifacts. So what you see at Freedom Park, it's a direct contribution by the communities. Right. But it was quite a challenge because we had to consult different sectors of society to reflect what we have today. So
let's consult another different sector of society, and that's why we have you here, Mr. Liebenberg, as a farmer. What has made you pursue the kind of work that you're doing, that is of skills transfer in the agricultural sector to the black community? Were you too trying to change the racist paradigm? What made you believe that you could be part of this and be part of history, so to speak?
Thanks, Sabi. So, yes, thanks for the question. I think from my side, where I'm an agricultural, the biggest thing is always it's a business. And when you're in business, you have to give back. In rural communities, obviously, there is a lot of communities around us, and there's always a chance to help up-and-coming farmers. And luckily, I'm involved in agriculture, so I can be of help there.
I ask you this because the farming community is very important, but it's also one of the most divided, and we've seen recently when we look at Senegal being used as a tool of being one of the most divisive in society. So did you have to reflect back on who you are? Because the issue of land is also very emotive. So here you come as farmer Johann Liebenberg and you say, well, let me teach you how to farm. How do I know that it is in line with perhaps my previous historical heritage that would do me in better stead? So where did you see yourself in changing this narrative?
It's a piece of, from my side, I can say that the relationship that I gather with people in my community, black, white, it's a personal relationship. It's a relationship that I conquer with people, that I make with people, and out of that relationship, and as it grows, and then we get involved with each other. So through JVs that I've done with up and coming farmers. And also mentorship programs, it always boils down to the relationship. Where there's no trust, there can't be any meaningful relationship. And when there's no meaningful relationship, there can be there's no place for me to help and to be part of the projects that I'm involved in.
Prof, let's come back to you in just talking about the approach from Mr. Liebenberg's projects and how he says it works out. As I mentioned, our collective memories can be at odds with not only our identities and how they're reflected and asserted in our democratic transition, particularly given that it's really traumatic for a majority of South Africans. So efforts like this, naturally, they come with a lot of distrust, but how do you say they shouldn't? This is why we need to reconcile. If we're going to deal with the land issue, this is why.
Sorry.
Professor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yes. I just wanted to be sure that you're directing the question at me.
Yes, I am.
Okay, great, thanks. So, I think that from what I hear Johann speaking about, that one should commend those kinds of efforts. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there are many, many people in South Africa from different backgrounds who are committed at a personal level to try and, as the President said earlier today, to build bridges. And these personal efforts are fundamentally important. They're part of the building blocks towards, finding one another. Nonetheless, I think it is important to also recognize that there are deep systemic inequalities, so deep systemic historical issues that we need to confront. And so you're asking quite a big question, right? And that is, how can efforts such as what Johann is involved in contribute and potentially overcome these very deep divisions? And I think that whilst they can contribute, unless we address very fundamentally and head-on the deep systemic issues, then these individual efforts, as commendable as they are, will always come up against these systemic problems. Now, if we take the question of the land, we've been running in circles, quite frankly, over the last 26 years in relation to resolving the land question. Now, there isn't a single answer about how to resolve the land question. There are many different forms of land tenure, different ways in which the land is being used, different ways in which people who have been dispossessed would like to use the land. And so in my mind, these are the issues that we need to confront and combine that with the kind of individual, small, local efforts that are being taken. And these are the two things in my mind that we need to do together. Otherwise, we are constantly going to come up against the very hard, very difficult, very stubborn structural limitations.
And how does the Wits History Workshop, seek to do that?
So, I think you asked earlier on, what is the role of history and memory? And I would say that, one has to be modest because we all have to make some kind of contribution. One of the things which I think we have not done as a society, even though we often believe that we have, for example, through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is that we've not really accounted for the past. We return to the past in very limited ways and in quite narrow ways to score political points, to make ideological arguments and the like. There's a lot of work that needs to be done that, research entities such as the one that I'm involved in, the History Workshop, but also colleagues across the country, in universities, outside universities, like in Freedom Park, District 6 Museum, and people in communities. So let me give you one example. I'm working with a group of people who were involved in non-racial sport in the 1970s and 1980s. Now, sport is a big issue when it comes to reconciliation. And these were people who, in the heyday of apartheid, were involved in non-racial sport, in building community sport across the country. But they feel very strongly that at the moment of democracy, at the dawn of democracy, and in the name of reconciliation, that kind of sporting activity, which involved hundreds of thousands of black people across the country, was marginalized. They were pushed to the side in order to give emphasis to the kind of spectacular nature of nation building. And what were those spectacular moments? They were the Rugby World Cup, the AFCON, the Olympics, and so on. And so what one sees at SABC when one talks about what work can history do, is to remind people that an important part of reconciliation, which has been about sport, right, which is about the spectacle of the nation, when we give attention to that dimension only, and we don't give attention to the very deep history of sport, then we are going to miss what reconciliation should be
Prof,
about.
let me stop you right there because I want to pick up on that and pass the baton on then now to Ms. Mufamadi. If you take that transgenerational transfer of memory, and let's talk about sports, for instance, the contradictions that we're seeing today when we see talks or arguments around Black Lives Matter, how do you reflect that in a museum, for instance? Because as I mentioned earlier on, there's those who are saying if we have to reimagine ourselves as a country, we have to make a clean break with the past. Can you do that now? We said sport played a very important role in building us up as a country, but now it comes out that actually not all is well. Ms. Mufamadi, how do you do that? How do you reflect that in a museum and the work that you do?
I think it depends on how we look at it. Yes, it does not always bridge the gap, so to speak, but there are instances where if properly utilized and contextualized, it can be used to promote the reconciliation or the coming together of communities, because within sports, if you love a certain sports and you have heroes and heroines in that sports, irrespective of the color line, they can become your role models or your heroes without really looking at who is that. And that is why when people go to watch games, they will go irrespective of the color. However, if there is no conscious education around that, you may still see people divided as they're sitting in the stands and so forth and so forth. However, there is a lot of education that we need to do. And this is what we do within the museum, like Freedom Park, for example. One of the epochs within our museum, which is nation building and continent building, we showcase also the 2010 Soccer World Cup. We showcase also the Rugby World Cup, where people forgot who they are in terms of the color lines and the racial lines, and they were all South Africans supporting South Africans team to win. But there must be some progress in terms of education and awareness that goes before that, because I think one thing we need to realize that is that the divisions are created and man-made, and people are actually taught to look at themselves differently from the other. But if we can teach them to look at each other differently, we can also teach them to look beyond the race and other things that we think divide us and forge that unity in diversity and focus on the beauty of our differences as that which enriches us and strengthens us. And within Freedom Park, we have a lot of programs also intended for young people that encourages them through those aspects. How do we can even talk about music. The same happens to music. Music lovers will love music irrespective of the color of the person that is singing. If the music speaks to you, you will love it irrespective. However, there is a certain level where you may need to give a little bit of a push through education and awareness so that people can move beyond those barriers.
Mr. Liebenberg, in your approach of the mentorship that you do or the projects that you have with young black people, how do you have the discussions? Again, I go back to the issue of land ownership, because there's still a whole big issue of how would you have come across the land. It's a business ultimately, as you say, you're teaching them to empower themselves, but do you delve into those deep conversations in your mentorship, in those projects? Do you come across those things where people would perhaps say, why would you do that for that race when you should be empowering your own race, because they are currently marginalized? Some people have been so critical of affirmative action, for instance.
Yes, so, well, normally I don't really get into political engagement. I say political with a big P. I get more into poetic engagements. But yes, sometime it comes up, and there is different programs within government where farms the government has bought are being distributed to different applicants and different beneficiaries, and those farms have their own mentorship program. Some of them work, and we can have an argument of how much they work and how much they don't work. But in the end, it boils down to the work that I do is I try to create one or two or three or four or five person. I try to create a sustainable business for that person. It's not just go out, teach them a few skills, show them how to put in a plow into the land, put a maize pit into the soil. It's try to take a holistic view. So to try and teach from A to Z, and when we path our ways, to have a sustainable business and a sustainable agricultural setup for them. And then I see this project as a success. Otherwise, we are just playing around.
And I'm going to use Mozambique as an example, for instance, within the whole Pan-African ideal of reconciliation. As farmers, you have networks within those regions. So how do you see that working out? Empowering those here, those in other parts of the country in dealing with some of these challenges?
So yes, we are currently in discussions with the AU as well as NEPAT and other organizations, where they also have programs that they are busy rolling out with youth development as well as women development in the agricultural sector. And our discussion is also around how do you create a sustainable business for a person that's currently maybe unemployed or is in a different kind of employment that wants to be into agriculture. And Mozambique, the need is as big and bigger as in South Africa, and we are busy rolling out and having discussions on those programs as well.
All right, and just a quick and final comment from you, Prof, on the intangible heritage that will help us across this hurdle of reconciliation. What is the most important one, would you say?
Well, I mean, I think, you can take your pick. I think that we're all different. I think, we have a very, strong, long tradition of storytelling. In my discipline, we talk of oral history, but that includes poetry, it includes music, and we have a rich heritage. And I think that often we ignore, we forget, we don't give enough emphasis to these dimensions because they're not only important in terms of the fundamental building blocks of people's cultures, and there are various cultures, but all these cultures also mix. So I'd say, that is where we need to give some attention to intangible heritage.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but thank you to all of you for your time, for your insights. Freedom Park CEO Jane Mufamadi, farmer and entrepreneur Johann Liebenberg, and Professor Noor Nieftagodien from Wits History Workshop.